Hello, hello.
I'm Savannah.
And I'm Elysia.
And this is Burden of Proof.
Welcome.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
We have a little bit of business to get to up front here for those of you who skip the banter.
Yes.
You may want to skip, but I would suggest you don't because we're going to do some shout outs real quick. I want to give a shout out to Sally. Thank you so much because I think it was at this point it's been a couple weeks, but we said we didn't know when, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it's Donald Trump. We said we didn't know where that started, and Sally went back and she figured it out, and it started in episode 33, in case number 33. So if you are one of those people who likes to know the inside jokes and where they come from,
yeah,
that's where that one comes from. You can start there.
Yeah, and didn't she say we had already been saying if it looks like a duck?
Yeah, I say that a lot.
But then in that episode, I think you said it, and because I was like, we say this all the time, and so I added,
it's Donald Trump.
It's Donald Trump. Sure. Anyway, any other shout outs?
To the people who suggested this case.
Yeah, James originally suggested it.
James did originally.
Our Patreon followers voted.
Yes, they did. And if you are a patron and you're listening, which I'm sure you are because you guys are awesome, this episode is coming out on May 30th. No. It's already on the board. May 16th. May 16th, which is right around the time when we will be finalizing the poll for the June case.
Okay.
So go check it out. Let us know what you want to hear in June. We'll have a couple options posted for you. I will be covering it in June. So buckle up. Big pop-up.
Okay.
I'm in a mood.
No, that's good. We've had like a string of cases that it's difficult to find any humor.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is one of those.
Dang it.
I hate to say it, but yeah, you might find like a couple of little things. But it's good that you're in a good mood because that way it won't bring you down any further. Like you'll be normal. You'll be stabilized.
Cool. And I hope you guys enjoyed the little break we got from all these sad cases last week with the society murders, and now we're right back into it. So,
yeah, I mean, this ends well, so that's good, but it takes a while. So,
yeah,
it was an interesting case for sure. So, thank y'all for voting on it, and yeah, if we don't have any other,
we have one more
thing.
One more thing for those of you who are on the Patreon live stream, and we may have mentioned it in another episode.
Oh, yes.
Not sure. I had originally said that I was going to be covering the vampire rapist, and I can't remember his name now for the life of me.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to put a pause on that. We're not doing that one. Kiss it goodbye and move on. It made me sad.
It made you sad. Well, it was a lot.
It's just one that I don't want to cover, and goodbye.
It's okay to say that it triggered.
It was very upsetting.
It's very upsetting and very triggering.
And I can't talk about it. So we're going to.
That's fine.
Yeah. So sorry. I said I was going to do it and then went to go do it. And I don't want to.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's a tough world.
And if you don't want to do it, I'm not sure I would want to.
Yeah. I mean, I think you would probably be okay. I think you've covered worse.
Oh, okay.
But, it's just not in the cards.
Okay.
I'm holding the cards. It's not there.
Okay. Well,
the magic 8 ball says
not.
Try again later.
Not now. Yeah. Fair. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I think the figure 8 ball.
The figure 8 ball.
I think the magic 8 ball says not yet. I think those are the options.
True. From what I recall.
Yeah.
I haven't touched one of those since like 8th grade. 1991.
Yeah.
92.
Okay, that's all of our news. It's all of our announcements.
Yeah. Well, we'll jump in because today's case is, I don't think it's a super long one, but
can't be any longer
than last week's case.
When we're recording this, the Kirtland cult killings just came out. That I think was our longest episode to date.
No, well, maybe. Diane Downs was pretty long too.
Oh,
I don't know.
I don't think either part of Diane Downs was that long.
It was long, but okay. We won't get into it. If you're new here, I just didn't want to make it 2 parts. No,
I agree. So I think that it was the right choice.
Long.
I think that was the right choice. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was people loved that case. It was fascinating.
I'm glad. I have a love-hate relationship with that case.
Right. If you haven't listened to it, I recommend. It's a good episode. It's really sad, but it's really good.
Well, today's episode is sad, but we will end on a happier note. So
we got an HEA. I love it. Happily ever after.
Yeah. So our case today about Bonnie Craig started way back in ye olden days of September 1994.
Woohoo!
When 18-year-old Bonnie was a freshman at the University of Alaska. Before we dive into the events of the crime, I want to give you a little background on Bonnie.
Okay.
She was the second eldest of 4 kids. She and her brother Jason were born to their mother Karen and her first husband Gordon. But after just 5 years of marriage, the two had an amicable divorce and went their separate ways. From what Karen says in her book, Justice for Bonnie, Gordon wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't very active in the kids' lives. And after they split up, he said he didn't want to hold them back from
seems like a cop-out answer, but
moving on with their lives, I guess.
Okay.
It was the 1970s. You know, there was that taboo of single mom with kids and people not wanting to get involved or date single moms. And so I think that that's why, but I don't really know. Anyway, so it was Gary, Karen's second husband, who Bonnie actually called dad and considered her dad. He had treated Bonnie and her older brother Jason as his own kids pretty much from day one. Karen and Gary went on to have 2 more kids together, Adam and Samantha. So Bonnie grew up the nurturing big sister who was reportedly always kind and beloved amongst not just family, but friends as well. She was also notoriously responsible, always working hard to achieve goals, including being the first girl on the wrestling team at her high school.
Love it.
She had also started a chapter of SAD, Students Against Drunk Driving, at her high school after her friend Katie died in a drunk driving accident.
Sad face.
Yeah. Karen and Gary's marriage became strained after moving pretty much every year all over Canada and the US.
Oh, Canada.
I specifically waited for you to do that.
I hate that I'm so predictable.
When the couple called it quits, they were settled in Anchorage, Alaska, and decided to stay there due to Karen's ties, or in part, I'll say, due to Karen's ties to her career as a journalist and a reserve undercover officer for the Anchorage Police Department. She eventually made a switch to real estate, but continued volunteering with the APD, mostly assisting with drug cases. Karen then met Jim, and when the two blended their families into one household, it made for tight living quarters. Karen with her 4 kids, and Jim had 2 or 3 himself, I believe.
That's a lot of kids.
Yes. So by 1994, Karen's eldest son, Jason, had moved out on his own, and Bonnie decided to move in with her father, Gary, the one who raised her. Although Gary never adopted them. So if I sound a little like her father, but yeah, legally speaking, he always just stayed their stepdad and then ex-stepdad, but he was in their life.
Right.
And they called him dad. So Bonnie had wanted to go with her boyfriend Cameron to California to attend Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
But her parents felt she wasn't ready to go so far from home yet and convinced her to attend a couple years at the University of Alaska first. I'm not sure if she just did not yet drive at the time or just didn't have a car, so she didn't regularly drive. But she would regularly walk to the bus stop early in the morning, 2 days a week, take the bus to the university, and then not get back home until late in the evening because she would often stay after school, after classes, to use the computers to chat with Cameron.
Right. Okay.
Long distance relationships were a lot harder without the technology of cell phones and video calls. I can't imagine what their long distance phone bill would have been like.
Yeah. Seems like a lot.
From Alaska to California, if she had been calling him from home. Yeah. The last week in September of 1994, Bonnie was attending classes, working her regular 30 hours a week at Sam's Club, and watching her younger siblings, Adam and Samantha. Karen had gone to Florida with Jim to attend his brother's wedding, leaving the kids with Gary. But then Gary had a last-minute work trip for a few days. Karen was not happy about it, but Bonnie assured both her and Gary that she could handle it. And she did. Everything had gone smoothly, and Gary returned home on a day that Bonnie was at school. So at 10 p.m., when Bonnie normally would have been getting around home, she usually got home, I guess, between like 9 and 10 p.m. They were kind of concerned that it was already 10 and she still hadn't shown up, but then they got a knock at the door. Instead of it being Bonnie, Gary was faced with an Alaskan state trooper who informed him that Bonnie had been found deceased face down in a creek after falling down a 30-foot cliff.
Why was she near a cliff? She was at school.
That's a good question.
That's why we're here.
That is obviously the question that they asked, because they said McHugh Creek, that park, that hiking trail is like miles away from home and school. What would she be doing there?
Wow, I don't know why I kind of forgot why we're here. I was like, oh my gosh, what happened?
So a woman who had been hiking there found her that afternoon, but it took them some time to identify Bonnie because they found no belongings, no ID, nothing. They were only able to identify her by her class ring that had her name engraved on it. Adam and Samantha recall sitting at the top of the stairs watching as Gary nearly fell to his knees and began sobbing. Gary informed the state trooper that Karen was in Florida and on a boat, but gave them a number to somebody, I believe it was Jim's ex-wife, who then gave them Jim's brother's phone number.
Okay.
It was around 2 a.m. Florida time when Karen and Jim were awakened by footsteps on their boat. Ken, Jim's brother, was there with a Post-it note in hand, repeatedly saying how sorry he was. Karen was in disbelief. She was sure it was a mistake because Bonnie had been at school that day, and the park, like I said, was nowhere near home or school. And she didn't drive. Like, it was far enough away that she would have had to get a ride or drive there.
Right.
When Karen regained her composure, she and Jim found a phone to call the state trooper back. Detective mode set in quickly, but the trooper was insistent that there was no evidence to indicate it was anything but an accident, and they needed her to come identify the body.
There is evidence that it wasn't an accident. Why was she there?
Yes. Well, the state trooper was trying to just keep her calm. And
oh, I see what you're saying. I thought he was being like rude.
Not really. She just, we'll get into how Karen feels about it. Since she's a reserve officer herself, it gets messy.
Okay.
Karen and Jim flew back on the first flight they could get, and she spent the entire flight in denial, convinced that she would get there and find that it wasn't Bonnie. It was a mistake.
Right.
Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And as a mother, Karen was devastated. As a detective, though, Karen was horrified that the state troopers must have missed something, and it was a big something. She stood at the medical examiner's office demanding that they call the state troopers to come back and examine Bonnie again. According to Karen, there were clearly defensive wounds on Bonnie's arms and hands. Her knuckles were all swollen and bruised, and some of her fingers were clearly broken.
Oh my, and bruh.
Yes. So Karen, from the beginning, was insistent that no, this was murder. She was someplace she wasn't. Why would she be there? You didn't find any of her things. And she's got these wounds on her that don't make sense. Needless to say, this didn't get her and the state troopers off to a good start. Initially, the troopers attempted to put Karen off by telling her that they believed it was an accident, but assuring her that they would fully investigate. That didn't fly with Karen, though. She could not sit idly by, in part because she carried a lot of guilt. She questioned if a recent drug bust she was involved in had something to do with Bonnie's death. See, Bonnie looked a lot like her mother, so she feared that someone in retaliation of her mistook Bonnie for her and attacked her.
I understand why she got there, but I feel like that's probably a long shot.
You would be correct. When the troopers didn't appear to be handling the investigation the way she thought they should, she contacted detectives she knew through the Anchorage Police Department and asked if they could take the case. They, of course, said they couldn't because it was the troopers' jurisdiction.
Right.
That, in turn, created more tension between the troopers and Karen. When she felt that they were putting her off or, kind of dismissive to her demands about the investigation, she did the only other thing she knew to do. She began doing interviews with several local media outlets and printing flyers, bumper stickers, etc. to pass out. The sheriff then told her it was impeding the investigation and asked her to stop. Her actions were bringing in too many tips. None of them were helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that happens.
It was doing nothing but wasting valuable time in the troopers' eyes. So she begrudgingly stopped, but it just furthered their distrust.
Right.
What she didn't know is that they did have one piece of evidence that led them to believe it was a possible homicide, but they knew it would be difficult to solve. And they were very distrusting of Karen at that point because she had at every turn been trying to insert herself into the investigation from the beginning. And all that I could think of as I was hearing her story and watching the Dateline and reading the articles was that it's like the saying that doctors make the worst patients.
Yeah.
She knew too much for her own good. So
yeah, cops make the worst victim families as well.
Yes, exactly. It also didn't help that other people were reaching out to Karen trying to help, but they were feeding her fear that the troopers weren't doing enough. Like she had some people say, oh, well, I tried calling them to give them this tip of something that I saw or something they heard, and they haven't gotten back to me, that sort of stuff. She began working with a couple individuals who had experience in nonprofit victim advocacy, and they really amped up the efforts in keeping the investigation in the public eye, even purchasing ad placements on bus signs. Months into the investigation, the troopers made arrangements for her to meet with the medical examiner and go over the autopsy results. She took her friend with her for support, who happened to also be a reporter, and the trooper recognized the friend as a reporter and looked very disapproving at Karen. She assured him that the friend was just there for the support, not as a reporter, but I'm sure it just created more tension.
Yeah.
The medical examiner confirmed his findings. Bonnie had 11 deep lacerations on the back of her head, one of which caused a skull fracture.
Right, 11?
Mm-hmm.
You don't just fall and hit your head and lacerate, like...
In lacerations across the back of your head.
No.
Correct. He said while they cannot prove what caused the injuries, he did not believe it was from the fall due to the nature of them and where they were located. He confirmed what Karen had already seen, the defensive wounds on her arms and hands, which caused the bruising in her knuckles, but he could not determine for certain if the broken fingers were from that or from the fall. Like the knuckles made sense that they would be defensive. The broken fingers could have happened in the fall.
Yeah.
So he can't say for certain. Finally, he answered the horrific question Karen had been asking the entire time. Had Bonnie been raped? He said he did find bruising and slight tearing of tissue in the vaginal canal that can indicate rape, but he did warn her that it's not definitive proof.
Right.
Because it was not drastic enough to say, oh, yes, that was definite force. However, the good news was they did get DNA samples from her body, her underwear, and even on the outside of her pants. Karen knew her daughter and knew that it meant she had been raped. Unfortunately, DNA was still in its semi-early days, and Alaska only required a record of fingerprints be kept for felons, and that did nothing.
Yeah, they don't have any fingerprints.
They didn't have any fingerprints to compare. They found nothing in the few other states that did keep a database of DNA. So what do you do next? It became a matter of elimination. But all Karen knew for certain was that early on in the investigation, the troopers had looked at her ex-husband, Gary, and had the whole family submit their DNA. They basically said, Karen, we need you to bring in your whole family, kids included, because we want Gary's DNA to compare, but we don't want him to refuse or become, too overwhelmed that we're trying to eliminate him. Gary, of course, was not a match, but he quickly caught on as to what was happening.
He's not stupid.
Yes. And so it put a huge strain on their already tenuous relationship. Despite Karen's misperception, troopers also ruled out the individuals involved in her drug bust. So that had nothing to do with it.
Well, that's good. I hope she was able to take a little bit of relief in that and take some of the guilt away.
Yes. They found 2 of Bonnie's coworkers who seemed a little suspicious. One who Bonnie had complained about to a supervisor, and one who just happened to forget to sign into a meeting that was the same morning that Bonnie fell.
In quotes.
Fell, we'll say. Well, they ruled them out through DNA. And obviously, the employee who forgot to sign in, there were other employees there that said, oh no, he was here. He just didn't sign in. The employee that Bonnie had complained about, he must have liked her or something. And instead of just asking her for her phone number, he looked in the computer at work and got her phone number and started calling her. So it was a little creepy. But he hadn't done anything major, and so once they eliminated his DNA, he's out.
Right.
Finally, they found a student in Bonnie's English class. It came to the teacher's attention first, and the teacher turned over the journal. Apparently, this student was going through a lot and suffering from some mental health struggles. And the day that Bonnie died, he didn't show up to class. But then he brought his assignment and his journal that the teacher would have them regularly write in. He brought that and turned it in later that day. And his journal entry was the writing of an obviously angry and distressed individual who specifically talked about the 28th of September being the day that he would really be tested, and even mentioned stuff about death. Then the troopers discovered that he had also been present at the park when Bonnie was found that afternoon. Very suspicious.
Oh no.
But he too was not a DNA match.
Bruh. You're telling me he just happened to be in the park? Don't shrug your shoulders at me. Tell me the answer.
Yep. He just happened to be at the park. Karen did, eventually learn that all of these people were excluded, but she definitely wasn't happy, especially about the student. She felt that was a little too suspicious. And her question to the troopers was, how do you know there weren't 2 people involved?
Yeah, that was my first
one
thought.
raped her, but the other one
was there,
maybe helped throw her over the cliff. You just tested his DNA and that's it.
Yeah.
And she wanted to see more.
Right. Why was he in the park? Why wasn't he in class? Why was his journal weird?
Well, The reason that they let it go was because his stepmother had said that he did have an alibi, that the reason he wasn't in class that morning was because he overslept.
Okay.
And she was home with him. So that's why they let it go.
I mean, it happens.
Yes. And they didn't really, as far as Karen's theory that there could have been more than one person, they, of course, didn't really have an answer for that, but they couldn't really do much else. They're like, he has an alibi. And the fact that he was in the park and missed class and stuff is kind of like barely circumstantial evidence. It's just, it could be evidence, but it could also just be a coincidence.
I guess.
So troopers had initially spent a lot of time walking and riding the bus route that Bonnie normally took to school with the hope that they would find someone who saw something, saw her with someone, etc.
Figure out last whereabouts.
Yes. Unfortunately, no one really remembered Bonnie, or at least didn't remember, even if they said, oh yeah, I've seen her around before. They didn't specifically remember if she had gotten on the bus that morning.
Right.
But later in the investigation, they did find out that there had been a substitute bus driver that day. The regular driver had been sick or something, and the driver who filled in for him had a significant history of hitting on young girls. He had previously been a substitute teacher, but was suspended for inappropriate conduct.
Ew.
And since being a bus driver, he had also been reported by several people for flirting or hitting on girls on the buses, including another bus driver's daughter.
Ew, David.
Yeah. So detectives discovered that he had left the state.
Ew, David.
And they tracked him down to Davis, California.
So suspicious.
Flew there to talk to him. And he was rather cooperative. He provided a DNA sample, and everyone was ecstatic when the test revealed it was a possible match.
We're closer than we were.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't like the way that you said that.
Mm-hmm. Before they could move forward, though, a new, more advanced DNA test had become available. When they retested it, he was not a match.
Damn it.
But isn't that scary to think,
oh, there's too many people. He
could have possibly been arrested and everything else and on being a possible match when he really wasn't.
Right.
Once they had the updated
It's also
technology.
Scary that there are two people in her life that were or on her paths that were suspects like that.
It is, but it's not weird to me.
I guess not.
Thinking back to when I was 18, going to college, working.
Right.
I had several weirdos. I
guess
just
that's
attract
true.
Weirdos, though.
You really do.
I mean, not as much anymore now that I'm older, but when I was young, I attracted some weirdos.
This is true.
So if I had gone missing or dead, they definitely would have had a handful of potential suspects. So the whole family was sort of, because it's like getting re-traumatized over and over. You get your hopes up, like, oh my gosh, we found something, and then nothing.
I cannot imagine that. That sounds horrendous.
So Karen kept up her campaign to keep it in the spotlight for as long as she could, and they ultimately tested more than 100 DNA samples, but none were a match.
Oh my gosh.
Eventually, the case went cold, and Karen finally came to a place of acceptance that they may never find who killed Bonnie, but she picked up a determination to lobby for laws that require DNA results of felons be kept in a database. She even left real estate to take a job in Florida doing just that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, mind you, we have flashed forward several years
right.
at this point. She knew that if she could get Florida on board, it would be easier to get other East Coast states.
Absolutely.
As well. Well, luckily, the federal government had been working on the same thing and introduced the CODIS system. In 2006, 12 years after Bonnie was killed, they found a match.
Oh my gosh, 12 years?
Yep. It was a man named Kenneth Dion who was in prison for an armed robbery he committed in 2003. It had taken 3 years for his sample to be entered into CODIS and alert the Alaskan crime lab that worked Bonnie's case. So the cold case detective flew to New Hampshire to talk to Kenneth. I didn't say he was in New Hampshire. He was in New Hampshire. I just realized,
I just figured he
I
wasn't
didn't
in the
announce
same.
that he was in New Hampshire at that point. Yes, so he was in New Hampshire. The cold case detective flew there to talk to him. He made casual conversation to find out who Kenneth was, where he'd grown up, and confirm that he had been in Alaska in the 1990s. He learned he had been stationed in Alaska while in the Army. He also learned an important answer to a lingering question Karen had always asked. Bonnie had been a wrestler in high school, as we talked about, and was really good. Really good. If I'm not mistaken, her goal was to never get pinned, and she never did. She's wrestling boys. So,
hell yeah.
Yeah, Karen knew that it would take someone with serious skill to restrain Bonnie. It turned out that Kenneth Dion was a 5th degree black belt and ranked 10th in a worldwide fighting competition. He bragged to detectives that he liked to engage in bar brawls and regularly carried martial arts weapons in his car.
The man just had some nunchucks.
Yes, nunchucks and something else that
Like a throwing star.
Not the star. There's something else that he had that was yep, technically those could make lacerations. So Kenneth went on to admit that he had been married back then, but screwed up his marriage and had regretted it since because he, quote, loved her to death. He said that it was in part because after he started using drugs, everything in his life went downhill. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army. He began disappearing for days or weeks at a time, even when his wife gave birth to their daughter. He wasn't there, if I recall correctly. He wasn't there for the birth. He came back right after she was born for a few days maybe. And then he took off and was gone for at least a week.
What the hell, man?
Yeah. Around that same time, he began committing armed robberies to support his drug habit. Of course, the detective knew he had been in and out of prison while in Alaska and had actually gotten released just 2 months before Bonnie's death.
Convenient.
Kenneth went on to share that he left Alaska in 1996 and moved to New Hampshire, where his addiction and crime cycle continued. The detective was surprised that Kenneth was being so forthcoming and not asking, why is an Alaskan state trooper flying so far just to talk to me?
Yeah, I'm sure you're real confused, bud.
I watched footage of the interview. He didn't. He seemed totally relaxed and he was being yeah, I'll talk to you. He talked very openly. No joke. He never seemed to question that at all.
So was he high at the time?
No, because he's in prison.
No, I know. Was he high at the time of the crime? I'm just speculating.
Probably, but we don't know for sure. But we'll get there.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's fine. That's a good question. I mean, you'd almost have to assume he was.
If he doesn't remember it, he's acting like he's so surprised.
Yep. So that's the very next sentence that I had, was that it all became evident when he admitted that he had a terrible memory.
We're dealing with Dory over here.
He told...
Just keep swinging.
Kind of. Hi, I'm Dory. He told detectives that he could remember faces, but not names, and that he had, in fact, already forgotten the detective's name. So, the detective put that to the test. He asked Kenneth if he had watched the news or read the papers during his time in Alaska, to which Kenneth said, oh yeah, all the time. He asked if he remembered the case of Bonnie Craig, to which Kenneth said no. And the detective explained, well, it was kind of a pretty big deal in the media, and then asked him if he had ever met a Bonnie. Kenneth said no, but I'm not good with names, so not that I remember. The detective placed a picture of Bonnie in front of him and asked if he had ever met her. And despite his claims of always remembering faces, he insisted that he had never met her before. Kenneth's body language suddenly shifted, and he kept taking short glances at the photo as they continued to talk.
He did remember her face.
The detective reiterated, asking if he had possibly ever met her even once. And Kenneth then said, 18 years old? The detective confirmed yes. Kenneth said, quote, hell no, my wife would have killed me. And the two have a chuckle. That's so funny.
Ha 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 ha. Murderer.
The detective shifted gears, stating, quote, the sad thing about it is that later on that day, her body was found at McHugh Creek. Kenneth said, whoa, whoa, whoa. What are you trying to say? The detective explained he was investigating and that Kenneth's name had come up with over 100 other names as possible suspects. Kenneth asked why his name would come up. The detective said that's what he's trying to figure out. After questioning Kenneth, the detective moved on to finding people who were close to him. One of his ex-girlfriends told the detective that Kenneth had said he could kill someone and get away with it, and that he couldn't ever go back to Alaska because of something he'd done. But it was in separate conversations and casual, so she thought he was just sort of blowing smoke about how tough he is.
But I can't even go to Alaska.
Yeah. But then she directed them to talk to her sister, who had also been close with Kenneth. And the sister confirmed that he had told her that the reason he couldn't go back to Alaska was because he killed someone.
Oh, okay, cool. So he's just telling people.
When the detective got back to Alaska, he called Karen, who was on vacation in the Philippine Islands at the time. He informed her that they found a DNA match and that he was confident they had the right guy. She said her emotions were all over the place, relieved that they had found him, but gravely worried that the investigation hadn't gathered enough evidence and he wouldn't be convicted on the DNA alone.
Right.
Still, the prosecution moved forward, and in 2007, Kenneth Dion was indicted and extradited back to Alaska.
You're coming back to Alaska now, boy.
Mm-hmm. It would take what felt like forever, though. There was a 4-year wait while they waited for the extradition process and battled things out through pretrial hearings.
Mm-hmm.
So the trial did not begin until May of 2011. 17 years. Right? Yes. 17 years after her death. The prosecutor knew it was going to be an extremely difficult trial because the evidence did not prove rape, and there wasn't any other evidence connecting Kenneth Dion to the crime except the DNA. So, from the start, he worked strategically to show the jury who Bonnie really was, because the defense was clearly going to be the claim that they had consensual sex, and to put both the investigation and Bonnie's character on trial. Karen wasn't entirely surprised when the defense attorney made the claim that the investigation from the start was flawed. After all, she suspected that. However, she went from being worried to being terrified Kenneth was going to get off when the defense attorney announced that the crime scene video had been lost years ago. The fact was that the sheriff was out of town when Bonnie was found, so he had put a deputy in charge of the crime scene and investigation initially, who was not as experienced and didn't exactly follow procedure to a T.
Right.
One reason the missing video was critical to the case was because they had not taken the proper photographs of evidence. But miraculously, the video was found like the very next day. Probably because the defense attorney announced it, they were like, oh, crap.
Oh, crap. We got to find it. We got to
that.
find that because we look really bad.
But I don't know if you're already thinking it, but that too was a potential problem. Because at that point, it could have led to a mistrial since it wasn't entered into evidence and shown to the defense prior to the trial.
Right.
So they took a 5-day break where the prosecution researched and prepared arguments in an attempt to say, no.
5 days doesn't seem like enough time.
Well, it only ended up being 5 days because they got lucky. Thanks to the arrogance of the defense attorney. He announced or said that he decided he was not going to request a mistrial.
Oh, well, that was stupid of him, but good for us.
Yeah. And most everybody speculated that it was because he probably was arrogant enough to think that he could win the case no matter what. Because
it was circumstantial evidence.
And
other than the DNA, which...
Right.
You know,
and still, even that is...
There's no smoking gun.
Exactly.
You know? Like...
They never found the weapons. They never found
it was 12
the rest
years,
of her belongings.
17 years later. The investigation was kind of botched. Kind of.
So the trial resumed and they presented the video. Karen told Dateline that she forced herself to watch, and surprisingly, the video was healing rather than horrific.
I can actually see that.
She said that she realized that she had been wrong for all those years. She had accused them of handling the crime scene incompetently, when in fact they had done their job as well as anyone could have. There truly was very little evidence at the scene. And remember, I had said that there was just one piece of evidence that had led them to believe that it could have been a homicide, but they weren't expressing that to Karen. It was there in the video. A leaf on the trail just feet from the cliff with small droplets of blood. They had collected it and sent it for testing, which confirmed that it was Bonnie's blood. So, you've got blood at the top of the cliff that shows that she was injured before she went over the cliff.
Yeah.
But still, not a smoking gun.
She could have fallen and hit her head and stumbled over the cliff, you know? Like,
true.
There's arguments.
Exactly. In all, the prosecution's supporting evidence was not a slam dunk. They had the DNA, but not solid evidence of rape. They had the droplets of blood on the leaf that indicated she was injured before she fell. They presented evidence that her pants were grass-stained and one button had been undone when she was found. And they had expert testimony that her wounds were not consistent with an accidental fall, nor did they find any blood on the rocks down the cliff.
Right.
Like I said, they knew that his defense was going to be that he had had consensual sex with Bonnie and to really put her character on trial. So the prosecutor called multiple witnesses to the stand to testify as to what a good person Bonnie was.
Right. And it was very out of character for her. And I think that, you know, any jury would see that. It was a jury trial or a bench?
Mm-hmm. A jury trial. They needed to show just how much in love she had been with her boyfriend, Cameron, and that she never would have cheated on him, especially not with a 24-year-old felon with a drug addiction, wife, and newborn baby at home.
No, it genuinely doesn't make sense, and I don't think that anybody who's looking at it from the outside, no matter what way they spin it, I don't think I could be convinced of that.
Well, if you saw Cameron testify, because he did.
I was going to ask, but I didn't want to know.
He testified, and even after 17 years and moving on with his life, he's married. I think he had kids. He broke down in tears on the stand when talking about how much he and Bonnie loved each other. He explained how even when he left for college and told Bonnie that they could take a break at any time if she felt like their long-distance relationship was too much to manage between school and work, she would still spend hours recording cassette tapes of herself talking to him and their favorite music and then mail them to him regularly.
This is so sweet. I'm going to cry.
Still, the defense attorney practically badgered Cameron and every other witness about how they really didn't know exactly what she was doing, who she talked to, who she hung out with.
You don't know that about anybody, though. It has nothing to do with the distance. It's a character issue.
Yeah. It was very obvious at that point that it was just, he's doing his job. He's trying to put just enough doubt in the jury's minds. But listening to how he went about it is cringy.
Yeah. Sometimes watching defense attorneys, it's so hard.
Yes. Possibly the most obnoxious example was when a man who Bonnie had known through either school or work, I don't remember exactly, he had been one of the many to be excluded through DNA testing, but he came back and testified. At the time of the investigation, he had told the troopers that Bonnie would call him fairly regularly, and he thought she might have a little crush on him. The defense, of course, asked about that, and the man explained that he had been quite arrogant in his younger years, often jumping from girl to girl, and that looking back on it and hearing the way other people speak about Bonnie, he came to realize that she likely was just really that nice to everyone and just wanted to be friends with him, and that he took it differently because of his outlook on life. So the defense attorney kind of pointed out that they had requested for this man to testify in the trial, and he refused. But then he agreed to testify on behalf of the prosecution. So he reiterated that in the years since, he was wrong about Bonnie and that she was just a nice girl. And despite him explaining it twice, the defense attorney's next question was about her calling him to ask him out on dates. And the guy was like, no, it wasn't a date. She simply wanted to be friends.
Yeah, like I've already said this.
Anyway, that was kind of what it was like for every witness cross-examination. It was then time for the defense to present their evidence and witnesses. And the claim was that the two had consensual sex sometime prior, even possibly days before her fall.
No.
And that a lot of people keep secrets from loved ones about some part of their lives, Bonnie included. If you're like me, you're probably wanting to scream. But he said he didn't know her before, and they didn't just find semen inside of her. They found it on her underwear and her pants. Why would she have sex with a dude like a day or 2 days before,
or hours
and
even,
still be wearing the same underwear?
No.
I think every woman
in the world could testify that nobody wants to keep those underwear pants on afterwards. No.
So
that seems like an infection waiting to happen.
Yes. Ew, David.
Ew, David. Ew, Kenneth.
So, yeah. If you're also like me in this sense, one of the most frustrating things about trials is that the defense can pretty much claim whatever.
Say what they want to say.
Even if there's no evidence to support it, because the burden of proof falls on the prosecution. So, if they are convincing enough to put doubt in the minds of juries, they win, no matter the facts. Frustrating. So, needless to say, everybody was
nervous.
Yes. The only evidence the defense really had to present was that no witnesses were able to place Kenneth Dion with Bonnie at any time. Period.
Yeah, literally ever.
Like ever.
Right. Which is also like not good for your story. You're saying that they knew each other before.
Exactly. But they presented it like, you don't know, this was her secret life.
No.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it was.
Still, the family waited on pins and needles during the jury deliberation because it was clear that it kind of could have gone either way. It was all dependent upon, did they really believe this defense attorney? They were incredibly relieved to hear that the jury did find Kenneth guilty. The sentencing hearing took place in October 2011, and the prosecution argued for the maximum sentence of 124 years with no possible parole because he had never shown any remorse or taken responsibility. And in a sudden outburst, Kenneth yelled, "And I never will because I didn't do it." After that, the prosecutor said, "And that answers your question, Judge. Nothing further."
Yeah, thanks, bud. You just took the words right out of my mouth, except you
helped
did.
Me. Yes. The judge did sentence him to the maximum 124 years, but with possible parole in 2090. So he'll be like 80 years old or something. Many people, including the prosecutor, do wonder if, given his drug problems, Kenneth simply did not remember what he had done, and his protests of innocence were sincere in the fact that he doesn't remember because he was likely high at the time. Still, they believe justice was served.
Yeah.
Apparently, his defense attorney really believes that he's innocent because he did an interview with Dateline too. I don't know how.
You can't gaslight science. Like, we've got it on lock, boys. And he said he was like in the area and a hot mess.
Yeah.
He's also got a record of violence.
Yes.
And the theoretical weapons in his car.
Yes.
And the ability to subdue her, even though she is unsubduable.
Yes. So, there you go.
Rot.
In the years since, Karen continued to advocate for state laws to require DNA testing for all felons and to enter the information into CODIS. Kenneth's DNA being in the system wouldn't have saved Bonnie, obviously, but it would have saved their family years of further trauma. And that's what Karen wants to save other families from.
Yep.
The memory of Bonnie has also inspired each of her siblings in its own way. Her older brother Jason says that it's formed the way he's raising his own kids. Her younger brother Adam has persevered through health issues and severe injuries after a car accident. And her sister Samantha finds comfort in helping others who go through similar traumas by working as a 911 dispatcher. So, like I said, I'm so happy when we can actually end on a happy note. And I'm glad that they finally found him.
Yeah, for sure. I am glad. The closure is nice, and this is going to sound horrible, and I don't mean it like this, but it is almost, it was a good thing that her mom advocated so much for her, and because of how long it took,
absolutely,
she was able to extremely help in other people's lives. I've heard of CODIS a million times. It's still a system that's active, and yeah, I mean, on that front, she was able to really change lives with her advocacy.
Yeah.
Which she may not have been able to do if everything happened, faster.
Yeah. It had to be very frustrating for troopers to have, I get that, to have a mom who's knows what she's talking about and is like, what are you doing? What are you doing? But at the same time, I couldn't help but think like they may have really let that go.
Yeah.
And it just would have gone cold and gone nowhere if she had not been so insistent to push for further DNA testing and to eliminate people and really push the theory that it was not just an accident. I mean, even if they believed that it was possibly not an accident, just because they didn't have much to go on and they have other cases that come up and
yeah,
so it was heartbreaking to think like if she had just been your average person, she wouldn't have necessarily known that the bruising on the knuckles and stuff didn't really align with a fall.
Right.
And it all could have been swept under the rug. And then good old Kenneth would have just continued.
Yeah.
Being out there, getting out of jail because he was set to get out of prison like in 2006 when they found out it was him who matched. He was in prison from an armed robbery in 2003, but he was set to get out to be released around the same time that he went to trial for this.
So it would have just, the cycle continues.
And who knows if he's raped anybody else since. Like,
Yeah.
so there you go.
Yeah.
But
Well,
the family saw justice and
they're doing
seem
well.
to be doing well. And so if you've made it this far, go ahead and leave us a wrestling emoji
Yeah, that's a good one.
on our social media so you can get your Sunday shout outs.
Woohoo. Well, you did a great job covering it. Thank you again to James, who originally suggested. Thanks to our Patreons or patrons on Patreon. I can't ever say those words
I know,
right.
I always struggle with that too.
Our patrons for voting and for getting this awesome case.
Yes.
And you did a great job covering it.
Thank you. I hope I did it justice.
You did.
Justice for Bonnie.
Justice for Bonnie.
All right.
Well, we will catch you next week, you guys.
Till next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, guys. Find us on Instagram and TikTok at Burden of Proof Pod and email us at burdenofproofpod@gmail.com.